"You're done!" Moon Joo-Won roared, his hand raised to strike again. "I'll buy this entire hospital and fire you before you even clock out." CEO Moon Joo-Won thought he was crushing a nobody nurse in blue scrubs. He had no idea he had just declared war on the most ruthless mafia boss in the city, a man who had been watching from the shadows with a single promise: to burn the CEO's world to ashes. The intensive care unit is usually a place of sterile predictability, a sanctuary where top-tier nurse Nia Wakanda worked tirelessly to provide for her unborn child. Known for her quiet demeanor and steady hand, Nia's colleagues knew nothing of the dangerous underworld she left behind, or the cherished sister status she held in the eyes of Han Ye-Jun. Nia's wish for a normal life is violently tested when Moon Joo-Won, a man used to ruling boardrooms through bullying, enters her ward. When corporate wealth meets an immovable moral object, a collision occurs that will cost the CEO everything he owns. This is a story of ultimate karma, proving that true power isn't measured by the size of your bank account, but by the strength of the shadows protecting you. The lights in the intensive care unit never truly dimmed, casting a perpetual, sterile glow over the polished floors that Nia Wakanda had walked for nearly 5 years. As a top-tier nurse, Nia moved through the ward with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her presence a silent comfort to the families tethered to the beeping monitors and humming ventilators. At 7 months pregnant, her lower back ached with a dull, constant throb, and her feet felt like lead by the end of a 12-hour shift. But she never let the exhaustion reach her face. She simply rubbed her swollen belly gently, took a deep breath, and stepped back into the fray, the calm center of every medical storm. To the doctors and younger nurses who looked up to her, Nia was a mystery wrapped in blue medical scrubs and a white lab coat. She was the woman who stayed late to hold the hand of a dying patient, and the one who always knew exactly which IV bag was running low before the alarm even sounded. She was kind, hardworking, and deeply private, never speaking of her childhood or where she went when she clocked out. They saw a dedicated healer. They had no idea they were looking at the cherished sister of the city's most dangerous man. Nia had fought hard for this quiet life of service. She had grown up in a world of whispered commands, blacked-out SUVs, and the heavy, metallic scent of power that followed her foster brother, Han Ye-Jun. As the head of the most ruthless Korean Mafia syndicate in the region, Ye-Jun was a man whose name caused even the boldest politicians to tremble. Yet, to Nia, he was the protective figure who had honored her desperate plea for a normal existence. He had built an invisible wall around her, ensuring that the blood and violence of the Han Empire never stained the threshold of her hospital or her modest apartment. Nia preferred the predictable stress of the ICU over the high-stakes terror of her past. Here, the enemies were infections and heart failure, things she could fight with medicine and care. She believed she had finally escaped the shadows, successfully burying her identity as a mafia princess beneath layers of professional excellence. As she checked the monitors in room 4, she felt a familiar kick from her baby girl and smiled. She was safe. She was independent. She was a nobody. But in the quiet hallway, the air suddenly shifted, growing cold and heavy as the double doors swung open with a violent bang, signaling the end of her carefully constructed peace. The clinical atmosphere of the intensive care unit was defined by its rhythmic, sterile predictability, the soft hiss of ventilators and the rhythmic pulsing of heart monitors. Nia Wakanda moved through this environment like a seasoned conductor, her presence providing a calm center for grieving families and weary junior staff. Despite the ache in her lower back and the weight of being 7 months pregnant, she checked every monitor with a practiced eye, ensuring her patients remained stable. To the world, she was simply a dedicated healer. No one in these bright hallways suspected she was the cherished sister of the city's most formidable shadow, Han Ye-Jun. This fragile peace was shattered when the heavy double doors at the end of the hall flew open with a violent bang. Moon Joo-Won marched in, his presence an immediate stain on the unit's quiet dignity. Dressed in a navy blue suit that likely cost more than a nurse's annual salary, he radiated a cold, corporate entitlement. Behind him, a frantic assistant held a single piece of blood-stained tissue over a tiny, superficial scratch on the CEO's hand. Joo-Won's voice sliced through the hum of the medical equipment, demanding a doctor immediately. He shouted over the warnings of a young resident, claiming his status as the hospital's primary donor gave him the right to bypass every protocol. When the terrified doctor tried to explain that every bed was filled with critical patients, Joo-Won shoved him aside with a sneer. "I do not care about your rules," he barked, his face twisting into an ugly mask of arrogance. "Fix my hand right now or you are all fired." The entire floor froze. Families of the critically ill looked on in shock as the billionaire's tantrum threatened the sanctuary of the dying. Nia watched from the nursing station as Joo-Won stepped aggressively toward a room where an elderly patient was recovering from a delicate surgery. Her protective instincts, shopping by both her profession and her hidden heritage, surged to the surface. Straightening her white lab coat and placing a protective hand over her belly, Nia stepped directly into the CEO's path. She held up a firm hand, her eyes meeting his with an unwavering, steady gaze that he clearly wasn't expecting. "Sir, this is the ICU," she said, her voice a calm but immovable wall. "Your scratch is a minor injury. You will wait in the lobby like everyone else." For the first time in his life, Moon Joo-Won was told no, and the look of pure, dangerous rage that crossed his face signaled that the storm had officially arrived. Nia stood like a stone wall between the aggressive billionaire and the glass doors of the cardiac recovery room, her heart hammering against her ribs, not out of fear for herself, but for the fragile lives behind her. "Put your money away, Mr. Hunter," she said, her voice echoing with a clarity that cut through the frantic beeping of the ICU monitors. "Wealth does not buy you a place in line when human lives are at stake. You will wait, or you will leave." The air in the hallway seemed to vanish. Moon Joo-Won's face twisted into an ugly, mottled red, his jaw dropping in genuine disbelief that a woman in cheap blue scrubs was defying him. He stepped so close that Nia could smell the sharp, metallic scent of his expensive cologne, his dark eyes burning with a cold, predatory rage. He began a vicious, low-pitched rant, his voice dripping with classist poison as he called her a glorified, uneducated maid, and mocked the very life she had worked so hard to build in the light. Nia didn't blink. She had faced far more dangerous men in the shadows of her childhood, and she refused to let his hatred break her professional peace. Realizing that words would not move this man, she turned her back to him, reaching for the wall-mounted phone to summon hospital security. That dismissive turn was the final spark. Seeing a nobody turn her back on him triggered a burst of unchecked violence in Joo-Won. He lunged forward with a guttural breath, his heavy hand whistling through the air. The smack that followed sounded like a gunshot in the sterile quiet of the ward. The force of the blow snapped Nia's head to the side, sending her plastic clipboard clattering loudly across the linoleum floor. Stumbling backward, she crashed hard against the wooden edge of the nurse's station. Instinctively, she wrapped both arms around her 7-month pregnant belly, shielding her unborn daughter from the impact as a searing, throbbing pain bloomed across her cheek. The entire floor fell into a horrific, suffocating silence. Doctors and nurses stood frozen, their eyes wide with the unthinkable reality of what they had just witnessed. A billionaire titan physically assaulting a pregnant healthcare worker in her own sanctuary. Joo-Won didn't look away. He simply adjusted the crisp cuffs of his navy suit, staring down at her with a look of cruel, triumphant satisfaction. "Maybe now," he sneered, "you will learn your place." He had no idea that from the far end of the hall, a pair of cold, dark eyes, marked by a scorpion tattoo, had recorded every second of his downfall. The double doors of the ICU swung open with a violent force, that seemed to suck the remaining air out of the room. Dr. Evans, the hospital's chief of medicine, rushed onto the floor, his face a mask of panicked sweat as he scanned the chaos for the source of the disturbance. He didn't look at Nia, who was still leaning heavily against the nurse's station, her hand trembling as it covered her reddening cheek. He didn't see the tears of shock pooling in her eyes, or the way she protectively cradled her 7-month-old baby bump. Instead, his eyes locked onto Moon Joo-Won, and his entire posture collapsed into a submissive, desperate bow. "Mr. Moon, I am so incredibly sorry for this unforgivable disrespect," Evans pleaded, his voice thin and wavering as he ignored the gasps of the surrounding staff. The chief of medicine didn't ask for the security footage or seek the testimony of the horrified witnesses. He only saw the man who funded the hospital's newest wings and private suites. Joo-Won adjusted his designer suit cuffs with a cold, slow precision, his face twisting into a lie as smooth as glass. "This nurse was aggressive, Evans. She refused to treat my associate and actually instigated a physical confrontation," the CEO stated, his voice dripping with a false sense of victimhood. Nia tried to speak, but the betrayal felt like a second blow that stole the very breath from her lungs. She looked at Dr. Evans, the man who had personally commended her for her steady hand just months prior, but he refused to meet her gaze. To Evans, Nia was a replaceable cog in a vast machine, while Joo-Won was the oil that kept it running. "You are fired, Nia, effective immediately," Evans declared, his voice hardening as he turned a cold shoulder to the woman who had spent years saving lives in his wards. "Pack your locker. You are no longer welcome on these grounds for instigating an attack on a VIP guest." The silence that followed was broken only by the clinical, rhythmic beeping of heart monitors, the very sounds Nia had once found sanctuary in. The hospital security guards, men who had shared morning coffees with Nia for years, stepped forward with heavy hearts and eyes cast toward the floor in deep shame. They took her by the arms, their touch uncharacteristically firm under the chief's watchful eye, and marched her toward the exit like a common criminal. As the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind her, Nia stood on the wet pavement, the first drops of a freezing rain beginning to fall, clutching a cardboard box that contained the shattered remains of her independent life. The walk back to her small apartment felt like a journey through a blurring gray nightmare. The freezing rain soaked through Nia's thin cardigan, weighing it down as heavily as the legal threat now sitting in her inbox. Every step was a struggle against the dull ache in her lower back and the sharp, throbbing reminder on her cheek where Moon Joo-Won's hand had struck. She kept her head down, trying to shield her belly from the wind, her mind stuck in a loop of disbelief. In a single afternoon, her decade of service had been erased by a man who viewed her life as a minor inconvenience to be cleared away. The next morning offered no reprieve, only the cold precision of a billionaire's malice. Nia stood at the grocery store checkout, a few essentials for the baby, soft onesies and prenatal vitamins, spread on the conveyor belt. When she swiped her debit card, the machine emitted a harsh, mocking beep. Declined. A flush of heat crept up her neck as she tried again, then a third time. The cashier's sympathetic look felt like a brand. Retreating to the sidewalk, Nia's breath hitched as she called her bank, only to be met with the flat, robotic voice of a representative. Joo-Won's legal team had moved with terrifying speed, filing an emergency injunction that froze every cent of her savings. She had nothing. No salary, no insurance, and now, no way to even buy bread. Exhausted and trembling, Nia climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, her only remaining sanctuary. But as she reached the door, the sight of a bright yellow paper taped over the wood made her heart stop. It was an eviction notice, effective immediately. Joo-Won hadn't just fired her, he had bought the debt on her building or pressured the landlord to cast her out into the street. He was systematically stripping away the layers of her existence, proving that in his world, a nobody didn't even deserve a roof over her head. Nia sank onto her small, mismatched couch in the dark, the silence of the room amplified by the rhythmic drumming of rain against the glass. She gently rubbed her swollen stomach, feeling the tiny, rhythmic kicks of her daughter. The fierce independence she had spent years building was gone, dissolved by a man who used wealth as a scalpel. She realized then that being good was not enough to protect her child from a monster who owned the light. To save her baby's future, Nia knew she had to step out of the light and back into the shadows she had once fled. Nia sat on the floor of her darkened apartment, the only light coming from the street lamps reflecting off the rain-streaked windows. The silence of the room was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic, mocking sound of the downpour outside. She had always prided herself on her independence, on the fact that she had built a life with her own hands, far removed from the blood-stained legacy of the Han family. But as she looked at the yellow eviction notice crumpled on the floor and remembered the cold, robotic voice of the bank teller informing her that her life savings were gone, the weight of her reality finally crushed her spirit. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was a woman whose future had been systematically erased by a man who treated people like disposable assets. She placed a trembling hand on her belly, feeling the soft kick of her daughter. This wasn't just about her pride anymore. It was about survival. Nia knew that in the world of men like Moon Joo-Won, honesty was a weakness and mercy was a myth. To protect her child, she had to become the person she had spent a decade trying to bury. With a heavy heart, Nia crawled toward the back of her closet, moving aside the stacks of old medical textbooks and shoeboxes that held the remnants of her normal life. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard was a small, cold metal box. Her fingers shook as she punched in the code, the click of the lock sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a sleek, unbranded burner phone, a gift she had promised never to use. She stared at the device for a long time, the blue light of the screen illuminating the dark circles under her eyes. To turn this phone on was to invite the storm back into her life. It was a direct line to Han Ye-Jun, a man the world called a monster, but whom she knew only as the brother who had once wiped away her childhood tears with hands that had just come from a battlefield. Nia took a ragged breath and pressed the power button. The phone buzzed to life, its signal bypassing every encrypted firewall in the city. She dialed the only number stored in the memory, a secret sequence that never changed. The line didn't even ring, it simply opened. Nia? The voice on the other end was deep, dangerously calm, and laced with an immediate, sharp edge of concern. Ye-Jun, Nia whispered, her voice finally breaking as the first sob escaped her throat. I can't do it alone anymore. He hit me, Ye-Jun. He took everything. The silence on the other end of the line was more terrifying than any scream. It was the silence of a predator that had finally found its target. Stay where you are, little sister, Ye-Jun replied, his tone shifting into a lethal, icy promise. The world is about to find out what happens when someone touches a Han. Han Ye-Jun sat in the suffocating silence of his high-rise office, the only light coming from the glowing monitors on his mahogany desk. On the screen, the security footage from the ICU played in a continuous, agonizing loop. He watched as Moon Joo-Won's hand connected with Mia's face, seeing the way her head snapped to the side and the sheer terror that clouded her eyes as she clutched her pregnant belly. Each time the slap echoed through the speakers, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, matching the lethal ice hardening in Ye-Jun's chest. He adjusted the sleeves of his black suit, the massive scorpion tattoo on his neck shifting like a living predator in the dim light. For years, he had honored Nia's plea for a normal life, staying in the shadows to respect her wish for independence. He had watched her from afar, proud of the woman who chose healing over the violence of their shared past. But Joo-Won had mistaken her kindness for weakness and her silence for a lack of protection. By striking a pregnant woman, the CEO hadn't just broken a nurse, he had desecrated the one thing Ye-Jun held sacred. Ye-Jun stood up, his presence filling the room with an aura of absolute, terrifying authority. He didn't scream or throw furniture. His rage was far too deep for such theatrics. It was a calculated, quiet fury that promised a total erasure of the man who thought he was a god because of a bank balance. He thought of Nia standing in the freezing rain, homeless and betrayed by the very institution she served, all because a billionaire wanted to flex his power. "Find every piece of Moon Joo-Won's life," Ye-Jun whispered, his voice a low, gravelly promise of doom that reached the four men standing like statues at the door. "I want his stocks to plummet by morning, his bank accounts drained by noon, and his reputation incinerated by dusk. I don't want him dead. I want him to watch his world turn to ash while he still has the breath to scream." The men bowed and vanished into the night. Ye-Jun turned back to the window, looking out over the city lights. To the world, he was a ghost, a myth of the underworld. But for Nia, he would become a storm that no amount of money could buy off. The war had already begun, and by the time the sun rose, Moon Joo-Won would realize that he hadn't just slapped a nurse. He had awakened a monster. The digital numbers on the massive monitors in Moon Joo-Won's private office began to flicker in a frantic, rhythmic dance of red. It started as a whisper in the markets, a rumor of massive, systemic fraud that no one could trace, yet everyone believed. Within minutes, the whisper became a roar. The stock price for Joo-Won's flagship conglomerate, which had stood as a monument to his arrogance that morning, began to plummet with a speed that defied logic. Joo-Won sat at his mahogany desk, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps as he watched his net worth evaporate. He grabbed his phone, his fingers trembling as he dialed his private banker, but the call didn't even go through. Instead, a cold, automated voice informed him that his access had been revoked. He frantically logged into his encrypted offshore accounts, the hidden millions he kept for emergencies, only to find a balance of zero. The screen didn't show a transfer or a withdrawal. The money had simply ceased to exist, replaced by a single, high-resolution image of a black scorpion. The silence of the penthouse was shattered by the relentless ringing of his office phones. His top investors were calling in a synchronized panic, their voices distorted by the realization that their leader was no longer untouchable. "Everything is gone, Joo-Won!" one shouted before the line went dead. He looked toward his head of security, the man who had stood by him through a decade of corporate warfare, expecting a plan or a weapon. But the guard was staring at his own phone, his face drained of all color as if he had just seen his own ghost. Without a word of goodbye or a glance back at the man who paid his salary, the guard turned and walked out the door, leaving the CEO in a tomb of his own making. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the city lights began to twinkle, indifferent to the fall of a king. By nightfall, the empire that had taken decades to build was nothing more than a collection of worthless paper and empty promises. Joo-Won clutched at his chest, the weight of the silence more crushing than any slap he had ever delivered. He was no longer the man who could buy a hospital. He was a man who couldn't even buy a moment of safety. In the shadows of the office, the air grew cold, carrying the silent, lethal promise of Han Ye-Jun. The demolition was complete. The cold, relentless rain of the city felt like needles against Moon Joo-Won's skin as he stumbled through the neon-lit back alleys of the industrial district. Just hours ago, he had been the king of a boardroom. Now, he was a man frantically clutching a heavy gym bag of emergency cash, his only remaining shield against total erasure. His high-priced leather shoes were ruined, caked in the same mud he had once looked down upon from the windows of his penthouse. He reached a nondescript, iron-reinforced door at the back of a shuttered warehouse, the office of a fixer, known for making even the most high-profile federal investigations vanish for the right price. Joo-Won didn't knock. He pounded, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. When the door creaked open, he didn't wait for an invitation. He slammed a thick stack of $100 bills onto a scarred wooden table. "Find out who is doing this to me," Joo-Won begged, his voice cracking with a vulnerability he hadn't felt in decades. I'll double it, triple it, just make the bleeding stop. The fixer, a massive man who had stared down the city's most violent gangs without blinking, reached for the money. But then, Joo-Won's shaking hand accidentally brushed the black envelope he had found on his bed, the one sealed with the blood-red wax of a scorpion. The effect was instantaneous. The fixer's hand froze mid-air. His eyes darted from the red seal to Joo-Won's face, and the greed in them was replaced by a hollow, chilling terror. Without a word, the man shoved the pile of cash back toward the CEO and stepped away as if the money itself were radioactive. "Get out," the fixer whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm paying you millions," Joo-Won screamed, but the man was already retreating into the shadows of the warehouse. Driven by a growing sense of doom, Joo-Won tried 2 more contacts, men who lived in the cracks of the law and feared nothing. At an empty parking garage and a dimly lit basement bar, the result was the same. The moment the scorpion crest appeared, the air in the room died. These predators of the city suddenly looked like prey, refusing his wealth and looking at Joo-Won as if he were a ghost already walking among them. Finally, he sat across from an old, heavily scarred fixer in a dark corner of a silent restaurant. The old man didn't even look at the bag of cash. He leaned across the table, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and horror. "I cannot help you, and no one else will either," the old man rasped. "You didn't offend a businessman, Joo-Won. You offended a god. Get your affairs in order." As the old man walked away, the weight of the silence hit Joo-Won harder than the slap he had given the nurse. He realized with terrifying clarity that his money, his power, and his name were worthless. In this city, there was no way out. 3 months later, the morning sun poured through the giant glass windows of a private VIP hospital suite. The room looked more like a 5-star hotel than a medical center, filled with the scent of fresh lilies and the soft hum of high-end monitors. Lying in a soft, comfortable bed, Nia Wakanda looked down at the tiny, sleeping face of her newborn baby girl, a tear of pure joy rolling down her cheek. She was no longer a stressed, overworked nurse struggling to survive. She was safe, surrounded by absolute peace. Standing quietly by the door was Han Ye-Jun. He still wore his sharp black suit, but the dangerous, lethal look in his eyes had been replaced by a rare, warm smile for his new niece. Ye-Jun had bought this entire state-of-the-art hospital just to ensure his sister had the safest place in the world to deliver her child. As Nia looked at her powerful brother, she finally accepted her new reality. She didn't have to hide from her past or fear the shadows anymore. She could be a gentle mother and a woman of peace, perfectly backed by an untouchable empire of power. Down the bright, spotless hallway, an older man in a stained gray uniform pushed a heavy mop bucket. He paused to wipe the sweat from his forehead, his hands calloused and his pride long since shattered. It was Dr. Evans, the former chief of medicine who had so quickly fired Nia to please a billionaire donor. Since the scandal of the assault broke, no hospital would hire him as a doctor. Now, he cleaned the floors of the very facility Nia's family owned. As Evans pushed his mop past the open door of the VIP suite, he caught a glimpse of Nia holding her beautiful daughter. He quickly lowered his head in deep, bitter shame and hurried away before anyone could see his face. While Nia started her new life, Moon Joo-Won sat in a cold, cramped federal prison cell. His designer suits had been replaced by rough orange scrubs, and his arrogance had been stripped away by the harsh reality of a life sentence for fraud and embezzlement. The man who once claimed he could buy anything now owned nothing but the 4 walls surrounding him. As Nia kissed her baby's warm forehead, she knew the storm was finally over. Justice had been fully served, proving that true power is never measured by how much fear you can cause, but by how much peace you are strong enough to protect. The most dangerous storms always hide behind the calmest smiles, and for Nia, the sun was finally shining. True power isn't the size of your bank account, it's the peace you are strong enough to protect. Moon Joo-Won learned that the nobodies you step on today might have shadows you can't outrun tomorrow. If you loved seeing this bully get exactly what he deserved, subscribe and like for more. Share this story to spread the message of karma, and comment below. What was your favorite part of the CEO's downfall? Turn on post notifications so you never miss a tale of ultimate justice.